Hi, everyone, and welcome to Barefoot with Spirit podcast show, and a special welcome to those in the Mediums Lounge community. I'm your host, Leanne, the Barefoot Medium, and I'm incredibly excited to connect with you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a medium, a twin flame, transformational coach, and intuitive criminal investigator who is blessed to connect with people from all over the world and to connect them with their passed over loved ones, as well as bring through channeled guidance to help those in twin flame union or relationship, twin flames, soulmates, any type of conscious relationships, as well as manifest what your soul needs, wants, and desires. Now, before we get started on this episode, I'd really like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand and on which my guest Antonella stands, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and First Nation peoples who are tuning in from around the world. Kick off your shoes, take some beautiful deep breaths, and jump into your heart space as we step into this sacred container and have a deep, connected conversation with my guest, Antonella, on empowerment and boundaries. Now, welcome, Antonella.
Thank you, Leanne.
We have known each other for quite some time. Now, Antonella is the founder of Wisdom for Women and the charity True to You, where she dedicates her life to empowering women and girls through empowerment self-defense, ESD. Now, ESD is a globally recognized evidence-based methodology that teaches individuals to identify red flag behaviors and respond with psychological, intuitive, emotional, and physical skills, whether it's preventing unwanted situations or healing from past abuse. Antonella's approach offers a holistic pathway to self-protection and personal growth. Wow. I know that you do amazing work, so welcome.
Thanks again.
Tell me a little bit about how you started to do this type of work and step into this.
Well, so again, thanks for having me. I'm really honored to be sharing my story with your audience. I believe my work started actually when I was 6 years old. I was born in Germany and I saw a black and white martial arts movie. And at the time, I did not know what I was watching. I just was really tuned in with the feelings of, wow, I want to do this. And it wasn't until we moved to Australia, and I was 8 years old when we moved here to Brisbane, and I turned 18 10 years later, and I got to make my own decisions, and I started martial arts with my psychology degree. And long story short, as I was going through my Kung Fu training, I was most of the time the only female. And I always remember thinking, the way I interpret the teachings of martial arts and how I apply the teachings of martial arts is very different from my Kung Fu brothers. It wasn't until I was invited and I was given a full scholarship to train in New York in 2018 that I realized that this feeling of how a female interprets self-protection, self-defense is very different from how a male interprets self-defense. And I guess, I know with your audience, they're very open-minded. Past lives comes into it, and I can trace back to past lives of always been in a self-defense role, whether it was in the military or other types of martial arts in Asia. So that, I guess, has always been inside of me. But I really became passionate about my work when I realized that I say martial arts is horses for courses. It's not for everyone, but I believe you don't have to be an expert in martial arts to know how to protect yourself. I do believe, though, it is your responsibility to know how to support and protect yourself using a holistic approach. So I would say that's how my journey has come to this point today, of understanding that females around the world experience, I guess, abuse and violence on the spectrum very differently from how males perceive it.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that you bring that word responsibility into the mix, because, you know, with my background and research around particularly homicides and Australia, with most homicides in Australia are as a result of intimate partner violence. It's really important that we empower ourselves, which is part of what that topic is that we're going to talk about today, to, you know, take responsibility for what does feel safe and you know, psychologically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically. So I love that you've brought that word responsibility into it. Talk to me about the word empowerment and what that means for you.
I used to think empowerment was the same for everybody. I've been very blessed to learn and teach around the world. And actually, the word empowerment is very different for every woman. And so it should be, because you're talking about what feels and looks and sounds empowering to you, Leanne, may be completely different for me and somebody living in Vietnam or a woman living in Afghanistan. So it's real. And part of this empowerment and respect is that we need to respect other women's sense of what the definition of empowerment means to them. So one of the short definitions I've come up with, and of course it always changes as we transform and evolve, is that taking what you know in that moment for you individually and turning that into the sense of having the freedom to choose how to respond in that moment. That's empowering. Coming back to that sense of being responsible for yourself, having self-awareness, having self-value, self-worth, and then deciding in that moment, what do I need to do to feel empowered? And it will look different every day.
Yeah. And I like that you talk about in that moment, and, you know, also about how things shift and change as we learn, grow, and evolve, because, you know, nothing stays stagnant. We get new knowledge, new wisdom as we experience life and different situations, different experiences, and different relationships as well. And I love that you bring culture in, because, you know, it is very different. And having worked with people from various cultural backgrounds, it's important that we do acknowledge that it looks, sounds, and feels different for everyone, even in the same culture.
Yes.
Given where we come from, our own lived experiences can have an impact on how we see things and perceive things in the world. So I love that you bring all of that in. And, you know, one of the things that's popping into mind is about how, you know, in those present moments, in those little moments, we get to, you know, decide how we want to create and move forward with whatever we're being presented with. So I love that you bring that in. Talk to me a bit more about how that connects in with boundaries. And, you know, I know we're talking boundaries and empowerment. So how does that look?
Again, I'm so excited that you get it. And it just shows the emotional maturity around, you know, what we believe as women is empowering, and respecting others' version of what is empowerment for them. And what it looks like for me is when I teach, actually, I use a personality profiling tool called the Enneagram. There's so many out there. I just sort of really enjoy the Enneagram because it does have that mind, body, soul connection.
Yeah.
And interestingly, I've come to connect the Enneagram with self-defense. And when I talk about self-defense, a lot of people automatically think of martial arts. And as it so happens, yes, I have a background in martial arts, but I just want to emphasize that this is not about teaching martial arts. Again, it's the holistic approach to knowing how to recognize red flag behaviors and then being able to respond in real time.
Yeah.
So what I have noticed in my experiences working with women, and I have worked with kids too, but kids still, their character and personalities are developing. So with women, when we go through the Enneagram profile, they're either a fight, flight, or freeze personality. And I have seen that the particular type, and you can generalize this, I'm sure, to all different types, again, of personality profiling tools. But with the Enneagram, if you're a flight personality, which I'm a 9 in the Enneagram, so a peacekeeper, I would do anything to move away from conflict. I'm the mediator. In fact, I literally worked as a mediator for 10 years. So I would do anything to avoid confrontation, keep the peace at my own expense. So that's a 9 type, and that includes also the 4 and the 5 type. The freeze type are the 1s, the 2s, and the 6s. They are the ones that in stress, they freeze. They cannot think outside of the situation to get away or move into. And the type 7s, 8s, and 3s are the fight types. So they just, without even thinking, they move towards confrontation when really they should probably take a step back and go, oh, hang on, let me think before I act. So we have these subconscious patterns, and these patterns play out also in our relationships and our patterns of who we attract. So for example, it's no surprise that many of the women that I coach are 2s, which are the givers, the nurturers, the people pleasers. They will put their needs aside to put everyone else first. Now, there's a healthy level where you understand boundaries and you can recognize when you're going into that automatic response. And then there's, of course, the unhealthy version where you spiral down, and you then, without even thinking or having this self-awareness, you just say yes to everything and everyone. So how does that work with empowerment through self-defense? Once we understand our subconscious patterns, we can't unsee what we see. And then we start to really nurture that feeling of when it comes up and go, oh, there's that feeling, and taking the time to just go, I need a few seconds to just recognize it's there. And then moving into the strategic mindset, which is, I just need a few minutes before I give you an answer. That just regulates our thinking. And it's a muscle. It takes practice. And hey, I'm 47 and I'm still practicing. And there is no end to this journey of what I call the pursuit of empowerment. It's a lifelong journey, as you know.
Yeah. And I love that you talk about that, because, you know, I often talk to my clients about using a traffic light system, a red, green, yellow. And it's often that yellow, that pause, that moment where we don't often take that unless we consciously make a decision, a strategic decision, like you say, to pause and go, give me a moment. I just need to check in with myself and see what I want to create here. And I think that's, you know, kind of coming back to that. I have a choice and an option and a decision to make here. And I think, and I say women, and I do include some men in this as well, because I want to be really clear about that. Is that we need to take that moment to really go, actually, I do have the power to make a decision and a choice that fits and feels right for me. And I love that you talk about the fight, flight, freeze modes, because, you know, particularly when people have experienced, whether it's abuse or trauma or some situations or experiences or relationships which may be toxic and unhealthy, we can go into those trauma patterns or those fight, flight, freeze modes automatically and unconsciously. And, You know, I did a retreat in Vietnam recently, that one of the beautiful young ladies that, you know, gifted herself 5 days away from her 2-year-old child to teach herself how to take some tools to create healthier relationships. She was acknowledging she was in freeze mode. So we talked about that. How do we melt the ice cube? You know, and taking those moments and noticing when we go into freeze, and what does our body look like, sound like, feel like? Or when we go into flight mode, is it that heightened, you know, what does that look like? Or, you know, all of those things. So I love that you talk about that, and stepping into asking ourselves questions in that pause. What is it that I need right now? What feels right for me? And that's kind of that inner coach within us that we all have the ability to connect to and the power to connect to, isn't it? Whether it's
100%.
through martial arts and that physical presence in our body, because, you know, particularly when we've experienced trauma, we hold on to it physically sometimes, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. And this is why in the workshops, they are, I always say the word, or the sentence, we're going to use the F word a lot.
Yeah.
And they go, especially the kids are like, oh my gosh, what F word? And I'm like, fun.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so the training is trauma informed in that sense that it's very experiential. So we actually play games which model certain concepts and principles that we experience in the real world, and then we move the body and we just check in with the body and move whatever is stagnant. And like you say, having that conversation, having is that your inner coach, again, having that self-awareness to ask yourself, you know, one of the tools we say is we ask ourselves when we're in the yellow in the traffic lights, we use exactly the same. In the yellow, we're like, what's going on? Just asking ourselves breaks that pattern. It's a pattern interrupt. What's going on? How am I feeling? Do I know this person? Who's around me? How is this person angry? Who's around? And it takes, again, practice, which again, the workshops are designed that we practice, and I'm coaching them through real life scenarios that they bring up that is a trigger point for them. Like, we all have someone in our life that really gets under our skin. Great. Let me pretend I'm that person, and let's work through what would you ideally do and say to that person, so we can practice. And, you know, people do feel when they leave, they feel that it's quite funny. It's like, oh no, like I've got so much work to do. But at the same time, it's like, oh my gosh, you've just uncovered things I didn't even realize, those unconscious patterns.
Yeah. And I love that you talk about, let's, you know, work on those things that are getting triggered, really. And I use that word because it's what most people understand it to be, whether it's someone pushing your button or triggering those patterns. And what a beautiful, amazing gift that can be sometimes, to let us know what's there within us that needs to be worked on, developed, expanded, we need to grow through or heal through. And at the other side of things is looking at how we need to protect, and that responsibility. Talk to me about boundaries.
So boundaries are going to look and feel different, again, on a daily basis, depending on how you're feeling, depending who it's with. So it's really important that we don't judge ourselves, and we're not so harsh with ourselves. And I also said we don't victim blame. So it, again, that sense of taking responsibility and accountability for our actions, and being nurturing, and just sort of like giving ourselves a bird's eye view of what's going on in that moment. So boundaries will look and feel different. And again, you know, as I said before, I'm still learning that sometimes my boundaries can be really, you know, I might give somebody more time than I really have. In that moment, I tend to recognize I'm here longer than I need to be. Why am I still here? Is it taking something away from me? Am I actually enjoying being here, even though I really need to head off? Is this person actually taking advantage of me? Again, in that moment, to coach yourself and ask those questions so you're present and that you are using the strategic part of your mind instead of the emotional, unconscious part. So the boundaries, they're great opportunities. Like self-awareness is such a key thing. I think if people had self-awareness, I think this world would be a much more a cohesive space. But walking away from a situation where you recognize that I wanted to have strong boundaries and leave that meeting or that catch up after 2 hours, but I stayed an hour extra. Why? And then whether it's because you made a conscious decision, well, I actually really enjoyed that, being there, or it might be, yeah, we started talking about that, my friend started having issues with her partner and I felt that I needed to be there for that person. It's just being gracious to yourself that and self-reflecting on why did I maybe extend my boundaries more than I was hoping. But boundaries, in one of my workbooks, we have boundaries not only with our emotions and our our spiritual boundaries. We have boundaries as well with our time that I just mentioned as an example, our material things. So with kids, if kids are always wanting to borrow each other's iPads or phones, or so we have different types of boundaries in different spheres of our life. But unless we actually take the time to sit down and go, okay, what do my boundaries look like when it comes to my time, my possessions, my energy, other more dominant personalities will just take over. And a lot of young women say to me when they come to the workshops, Antonella, now learning ESD, empowerment through self-defense, does this mean I have to be a bitch? And I'm like, no. We actually need kind, loving, nurturing women just like you, but we need to change the definition of what we see ourselves with being strong, empowered, and assertive. Because sadly, being assertive actually is not something to celebrate, and we need to change that.
Yeah, and I think you bring in a few different things in amongst that, and I like how you talk about that checking in with self if you have overextended your boundary, or whether it's a conscious choice that you've done that, and the why, because I think we don't often take that time to really do that. And that's where I see that as being like that challenger role, where it comes in and we challenge ourselves to really check in and reflect and ask ourselves, where am I allowing this, or how am I allowing this to extend me, and why am I having this reaction to it? If I'm making a choice and a decision, is this my pattern? Is this someone else's pattern? And I like those questions. Boundaries and challenging ourselves to step back in and ask those questions of ourselves really allows us to, check in on why we're doing something and maybe break those patterns that might be sitting in the unconscious. I love that you bring in boundaries around time, energy, and resources, because we often forget that. And that was one of my old patterns, was overgiving, and that sometimes people can take advantage of that. And when we're conscious and present to that, we can challenge ourselves to grow and expand. And it doesn't mean we have to get it right the first time. And I also love that you talked about that, assertiveness and how that's viewed, and does that mean that I have to be a bitch? And I think it's really interesting how society or people in general can perceive people when they set firm boundaries around what's okay and what's not okay for them. And sometimes when we do set boundaries, there's a little bit of kickback, particularly if, and I use that word interestingly with you, um, because people are used to us being a certain way. And when we shift and change and transform and start putting boundaries in place, if that's what we're learning, then people need to adjust to who we're becoming rather than who we have been. And that can be a challenge for them as well.
Yes. Well, I mean, I don't want to go too deep down this path, but just something to be aware of is that, you know, when we're talking about sort of like perpetrator victim, and there's also another star, I think it's the triad, which I've heard, but I'm not qualified enough to talk about it. But asking ourselves, when we're not respecting someone else's boundaries, how are we perpetrating, you know, some behaviors that we don't want to tolerate with other people doing that to us. So we really need to check in with ourselves that when our girlfriends, our sisters, you know, friends, colleagues are asserting their boundaries, that we need to check in with ourselves with our reaction.
Yeah.
You know, if we are talking about really the sense of empowering each other, empowering women, we need to like accept their no, even when it comes to them saying, oh no, I don't want to go out for drinks, or no, I don't want to blow out money for on a Friday night. It's like, that's no, even between women, no is no, finished, you know. And we want to call out if someone's saying, listen, I've already said no twice and you're still going on. What is it that you're not understanding with my notes? What's going on for you? And hopefully you can have that maturity to have that conversation, because it might not be about you, it might be about them, that they don't want to go out by themselves, or, you know, and that's another conversation. But it's and it's also very culturally specific, right? So what we experience here in Australia is very different South America and Asia, in the US. So it's again us taking responsibility for our own, the way we present and show up for others. And I guess I always am conscious of celebrating and making it easy for other women to assert themselves, even if it's like, damn it, now I don't have a girlfriend to go out with, or she said no to me. I'm like, you go, girl, that's great, thank you for saying no. You're like, we need to celebrate that.
And I think that that is a beautiful point that you raise, is that when someone does set a boundary with us, they're honoring themselves, and it's really important that we honor and respect them in return, and step into empowering them and giving them the confidence to continue doing that. Because
Yes,
if we shut down someone else's boundary, then it can create other patterns of behavior within them that limits them and disempowers and puts them in victim mode, which is not where we want anyone to be. And I want to
exactly.
say, and our men, because
Yes,
as women as well, it's really important that we honor our men's no's, and men in return. So particularly mamas of boys, teach boys to set boundaries for themselves as well and empower them, so that they're honoring in return. And I think that's really key and important.
100%. Yes, and I want to emphasize that I use girls and women because that's predominantly the space I work in, but 100% boys and men deserve exactly the same tools and knowledge and education as women do. Like we got to work shoulder to shoulder, and there's great organizations out there that do work with men, but it's so important. I see us as humans.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
then really, if we do need to create two boxes, it's really the perpetrators and the rest of us who need to stand up against these people that violate and take advantage and manipulate us, right? So we need to work together, males and females, to call out this type of behavior. That's the only sort of like us and them kind of division I see. Otherwise, men 100%. They're humans. They deserve, there's no, this whole thing that's happening at the moment, the shift against, now it's not an eye for an eye, or two wrongs don't make a right. Really don't believe that. So I see in society that there's so much hate on men. It's like, well, you're doing exactly the same thing that happened to us as women. Like, I really don't agree with that. So I invite and welcome anybody who, again, wants to take responsibility, and fathers wanting to work with their daughters and their sons to be good humans.
Thank you so much. If there was a tip, one last tip that you would give people around empowerment and boundaries, what would that be?
It starts with know thyself, know who you are, and not to compare yourself to other people, because other people may have a different style of empowerment and a style of setting boundaries. So know who you are, what your personality type is, so it's congruent, consistent, and you're in flow. And you do need to work on yourself. So have that self-awareness, self-reflection. And ultimately, the self-worth is in investing in yourself. So if you know, whether it's investing in coaching and going to workshops, great. If not, there's so much information out there for free.
Yeah, beautiful. And Antonella, if people want to connect with you a little bit more and learn more about the work that you do with women and girls in particular, where can they do that?
It's the website. It's wisdomforwomen.com.au, and all my handles are on there. And I'm very approachable and very down to earth, and I am part of an organic global movement. So if you want to reach out or have any questions, please don't be afraid. This is a gift to yourself.
Yeah, awesome. And I'll put the link to Antonella's website in below this video or this recording for those who are interested in connecting more with Antonella. Thank you so much for joining me again.
My pleasure.
And, it's always lovely talking to you and learning about the beautiful, amazing work that you do in the world. So
thank you so much. Thank you, Leanne.
Pleasure. For those of you who want to connect with me more, jump on my website, thebarefootmedium.com.au. And until next time, I'll see you on the next episode of Barefoot with Spirit podcast show.